Alright, so today I want to introduce you to the Pewterpagne ball python. It's a pretty interesting combination of genes. It actually consists of 3 genes: the pastel, the cinnamon, and the champagne. So the combination of the pastel and the cinnamon is the pewter, and then you add the champagne to the pewter to make the Pewterpagne. And kind of the interesting thing about the project is the pewter can be really visually dominant, meaning when you work other genes into the pewter, a lot of times it can overwhelm the visual appearance of the other genes, and the champagne is also really visually dominant. And if you actually work the pewter into the champagne, you get this really interesting effect of making a pied looking snake with big patches of white in the snake, even though there's no pied in the mix. It's kind of an interesting combination. So today I want to jump over the internet and I want to show you the potential and the limitations of the Pewterpagne ball python. Alright, so I'm going to jump over here on Morphmarket.com and I want to start with the 3 genes that make up the Pewterpagne. And the first one I want to start with is the cinnamon. This is what one version of the cinnamon looks like. And I'd say the cinnamon's probably one of the most variable genes in all the ball pythons. It can really vary from almost like a dark, normal looking snake to kind of a coppery, reddish brown kind of a look to it. It's pretty amazing how variable it can be. And when you actually take the cinnamon and work it into other combinations, the final result of the visual appearance can really vary depending on what version of the cinnamon that you use. So I'd say as far as a typical looking cinnamon, this is probably kind of like your average looking cinnamon. Really good looking snake. Has a little bit of this coppery color in here. Not quite as coppery as the black pastel. I'd say the black pastel and the cinnamon are really close together. As a matter of fact, if you breed them together, they're allelic and make an 8 ball, which is the combination of the cinnamon and the black pastel. Looks almost like a super cinnamon or a super black pastel. I'd say usually the cinnamons aren't quite as coppery looking as the black pastels if you actually look at them just by itself. And here is another gene in the Pewterpagne, and that is the pastel. And the pastels can also be really variable. So essentially when most people think of a pastel, they're thinking of a yellow looking snake. Sometimes they can be really bright yellow, sometimes they can be kind of almost like an orange, like a rusty colored yellow. I've actually produced some pastels in my collection that are kind of a rusty color. I've also produced some pastels that are super bright. Like this one is really pretty amazing as far as the pastels. As a matter of fact, this is still for sale. I was actually looking over here at Morphmarket. They're not that expensive. You can actually pick this one up for $100, which is pretty typical for a pastel. And it's kind of interesting when you mix the cinnamon with the pastel, you actually get the pewter. And take a look at this. This is one version of the pewter, which is kind of interesting. It's kind of a reddish brown colored pewter. And just by looking at the pewter, you can kind of figure out which version of the cinnamon that you use. You can actually tell in this one, it's kind of the reddish brown version of the cinnamon. And I think to a lesser degree, it really depends on the version of pastel that you work into the pewter. I actually pulled up one more version of a pewter over here and take a look at this. It's pretty amazing the differences in the pewters. It can be from a reddish brown all the way to an almost a xanthic looking snake where it pretty much strips all the color. Some of these look almost metallic. It's pretty amazing. And if you actually take these two and actually work in the champagne, that's where you get the Pewterpagne. And this is what the champagne looks like. And let me tell you, when it comes to champagne, I'd say it's probably one of the most challenging genes as far as making combinations. A lot of times when you work other genes into the champagne, you'll get a completely patternless snake. Sometimes it'll be, you know, a little bit different color. Sometimes you can make some pretty amazing patternless snakes. If you're going for the patternless, let me tell you, champagne should definitely be in your combinations. But if you're actually trying to bring out a lot of pattern into your champagne combos, a lot of times there's really only 2 genes that can really bring out the pattern in a champagne, and that is the leopard and the enchi, which is kind of crazy. As a matter of fact, if you actually use the super enchi in champagnes, you can make some really crazy looking combinations that have a lot of pattern to them. But other than those 2 genes, I'd say a lot of times you'll actually end up with a completely patternless snake. So if you actually take the champagne and work in the pewter, take a look at this. You actually get a snake that looks like a visual pied, which is pretty amazing. And if for some reason all these genes come together and you actually get a pied looking snake with these big patches of white. And usually when we think about a pied, we're thinking about the recessive pied, where you need 2 copies of the pied gene. And this one, there's no pied at all in this combination, even though if someone handed me the snake, I'd say that looks exactly like a visual pied, which is pretty interesting. I actually pulled up a few more Pewterpagnes so you can kind of see the variability in the Pewterpagnes. They can really vary, and I think it really depends on the variability of all of the genes of the champagne. I think the champagne can vary a little bit. I've actually seen some champagnes that are a little bit different color, and then some of them have a lot more pattern or less pattern, and then you add the variability of the champagne with the variability of the pastel and the cinnamon, and they can vary quite a bit from one example to the other. And this one's kind of interesting and actually has quite a bit of pixelation all through the snake. I actually pulled up one more example over here. Take a look at this. This is kind of interesting. Here's another Pewterpagne. It looks completely different than the other two. It's amazing how different they can look with the same exact genes. And this one is really faded out. Almost gives it like a creamy appearance. Pretty awesome. And you can see kind of the pied looking color coming in on the back of the snake. And usually with a lot of your champagne combinations, you'll actually see this dark spot right on top of the head, which is kind of interesting. So I actually wanted to show you a few genes added to the Pewterpagne so you can see the potential. I'd say more, you can actually see the limitation of what the Pewterpagne ends up looking like when you add other genes to it. And one of the first gene I want to show you is the banana. And let me tell you, when it comes to the banana ball python, it is extremely visually dominant, meaning a lot of times if you actually work banana into combinations, you can see the banana color coming through the combinations of pretty much almost all the genes and ball pythons. It really brings out a lot of the banana color. And here's what happens if you take the banana and you work it into the Pewterpagne. Take a look at this. This is pretty amazing. You actually take a pied looking snake, just add banana, and you end up with a patternless snake. And essentially what it is, it's the champagne that completely dominates all the other genes, and you end up with the patternless snake. And you can still see the color of the banana coming through to a lesser degree. Usually in your banana combinations, they're a lot more colorful than this. This is kind of an interesting, almost looks like a yellow blue-eyed leucistic or a black-eyed leucistic. I'm guessing this probably has black eyes. Pretty amazing combination. So here is the Mojave. The Mojave is actually in the blue-eyed leucistic complex. And if you actually mix Mojave with certain genes, you can actually get some purple snakes like the Purple Passion and the Mystic Potion. It's a pretty awesome gene. And here's what happens if you take the Mojave and you work it into the Pewterpagne. Take a look at this. This is kind of interesting. You actually end up with an all-white snake. And at first I was looking at this, you know, since Mojave is in the blue-eyed leucistic, I thought, all right, we made a blue-eyed leucistic, but there's not another gene in the blue-eyed leucistic complex to actually make a white snake. So it's kind of an interesting combination of genes between all these coming together to form an almost completely white snake. I actually looked at a few more examples of these, and some of them are a little bit more yellow or brown. They can vary quite a bit from one example to the other, and you can definitely see the color on the head from the champagne. So here is the butter. The butter is also in the blue-eyed leucistic complex. A lot of people think the butter is really close to the lesser. Some people think it's the same gene, and I'm convinced that the butter and the lesser are completely different. I think the butters can be a little bit brighter than some of the lessers. Some of the lessers can be darker than the butters, but I've actually seen butters and lessers that look pretty much exactly the same. So there's definitely some overlap. So here's what happens if you work butter into the Pewterpagne. Take a look at this. This is another all-white snake, which is kind of crazy. It's pretty amazing. You just add one gene to the Pewterpagne, and a lot of times you'll end up with either a white snake that's completely patternless or a slightly different colored snake that is patternless, and that is pretty typical with a lot of your champagne combinations. So when it comes to champagne, I'd say it's pretty difficult to work with, but there are some really things, there's some things you can make that are pretty amazing. And what I would actually do with the Pewterpagne is I would breed it to a cinnamon and make the super cinnamon version of the Pewterpagne. And take a look at this. This is the really crazy looking thing. This is what you get. It's amazing. This is probably one of my favorite jeans combinations in all of ball pythons. Essentially what this is, if you actually look at the jeans in here, this is actually the super cinnamon and the champagne, which is the gray matter. And the gray matters are like almost a silver metallic looking pied snake, even though there's no pied in here, which is kind of crazy. As a matter of fact, if I was actually working with champagne, this is probably one of the things I would definitely go for. And kind of the interesting thing about the champagne, if you take the champagne and breed it to a visual pied and get the champagne het pieds with just one copy of the pied, you'll also get pied looking snakes, which is pretty interesting. All right, so it is time for the question of the day. And Gaming Pro Not Pro OG asks, how many years of breeding can you get out of a male or female ball python? And that is a very good question. So when it comes to the maximum age for ball pythons, as far as the age where you shouldn't breed them anymore, I don't think anyone really knows. I actually saw an article online. It was from the St. Louis Zoo. They actually had a 62-year-old female ball python that laid eggs at 62 years old, which is kind of crazy. I actually saw a picture of those eggs and they look perfectly fine as far as what you'd expect from normal fertilized ball python eggs. And at 62 years old, a ball python still laying eggs. I'm convinced that the ball python industry isn't really old enough to really determine even what the maximum age of a ball python is, much less the maximum breeding age of a ball python. So that's one thing you probably don't have to worry about. Your ball pythons will be breeding for quite a long time. I don't think anybody knows for sure what the maximum breeding age of a ball python is. So that is pretty much it. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.